Are you an HBCU student, maybe a parent, faculty, admin, staff? Ever been? Then this update is for you.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
What's up, world? Welcome back to I Mix What I Like. So I have a little bit of an update on my longitudinal exploration into the experiences of folks at historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, where, of course, I've been working for now going into my 18th plus year at Morgan State University in Baltimore. But I have an update that might even encourage a slight shift in the final form of this project. But first, I want to make sure you all know what the project is or reminded of the project. And if you qualify and are interested, I definitely want to hear from you. So the short of it is when you go to imixwhatilike.org or you simply go to the link in the show description here, in the main menu at the website under catalog, you'll see a link to this project here, HBCU's Not a Different World, where you will be invited and encouraged to participate based on your experience and relationship to these institutions. And for me, this starts with, again, my own personal experience, a lot of which demonstrates many of the flaws, many of the problems, many of the conflicts between what people think about these institutions, what they think they understand about the histories of HBCUs, and the actual realities, particularly for faculty of a certain politics. But as I've talked about as often as I can, sort of my quintessential experience or story is summarized in the statement that I got here, quoted verbatim from a former high-level administrator with whom I was in a long discussion about many problems that I was experiencing, others were experiencing, and this was the response. Dr. Ball, your problem is that you want to create new knowledge. We don't do that here. Your job is to produce menial laborers for the communications industry, end quote. So from there, and given many more years now in my 18th year at Morgan State University, having seen, experienced firsthand so many different, often negative occurrences, I wanted to do this project to eventually, in some form, which may be changing, tell not only my story, but those of others whose stories get erased and usually subsumed beneath waves of propaganda and mythology promoted about HBCUs in particular and higher education more broadly. So if you would, just you can finish reading at your leisure the rest of the description of the project, but ultimately I'm just inviting those who have been students, faculty, staff, admin, to share their story and send me a simple email with HBCU project in the subject, answering these or responding to these basic questions about your experience, and then telling me even specifically, I'm asking also to what extent the show A Different World played a role in encouraging you to work, attend, support HBCUs, a point to which I'm going to come back in a little bit. Because again, what I'm arguing is that HBCUs are not a different world, despite their promotion and the mythology targeting Black communities, suggesting that they are and should be. Now, I mentioned a little while ago that I had been asked to write a blurb for a new book, a forthcoming book on its way to being published. It is just about to come out, and the author and I are scheduling an interview. So you'll be hearing from him and more about this book in the not too distant future. But I did just want to share this by way as a way of an update that the book Black, Not Historically Black, subtitled Toward the Pan-Black College and University by Joseph L. Jones, is on its way. And I'm very excited about the book and the project, and very excited about getting a chance to talk with Professor Jones. But in the interim, I did just want to share something here in terms of this that I think maybe heading actually be imposing an update on me, in that I'm honored and excited that my blurb made the book and is reprinted here. But in the description, it says something that I thought was pretty interesting that I had not necessarily intended, but uh, may have conveyed and maybe pointing me in a different direction for the final project. So my point with the HBCU Not a Different World project was that I'm still not entirely sure what the final project will look like. Will it be a long form edited podcast? Will it be uh, an actual book? Would it be, or would it be more as what is described here as being, and apparently I told them would be as a memoir? So what I said in the blurb is that few institutions in Black communities are less understood than those deemed historically Black colleges and universities. HBCUs are popularly promoted as existing to serve Black communities, but despite their inability to do so, criticism of that fact is blunted by the very reality of their being labeled historically Black. Joseph Jones has produced in this work far more than an important history or description of his and others' experiences. Dr. Jones has provided here a tool, even a methodology for demystification and the establishment of new interpretation, analysis, and corrective action. Jones' contribution to the historiography of the HBCU must have its value met by collective action toward developing new approaches and indeed new institutions that will in fact live up to the fantasies generated and imposed about the HBCU and much else involving Black life and history. And in the description of who I am, they describe me as working on Not a Different World, a historically Black college and university memoir. Yeah, over here behind me, it says memoir. So maybe that's in fact what this will turn into. But ultimately, it requires, and I hope to get much more of, perhaps your involvement. I'd like to hear more from other people's experiences, as I will be incorporating some that are described in this book for sure. But I would like to hear more from you as well. And just a little bit from within Joseph Jones' new book. Again, we're going to be hosting a long form discussion with him about the book. Don't worry. But just for the immediate purposes of really promoting and highlighting this project I'm working on and hoping, to hear more from you on and to be spurred on to finally a conclusion at some point. Spurred on, that is, to a conclusion at some point. Part of the project is to identify the differences or the distinctions or the contradictions between what is promoted as the HBCU experience and the actual lived experience. And one of the reasons, or one of the areas of exploration one of the areas I want to explore in that, at least somewhat, is the extent to which the television show A Different World, and perhaps some others, I mentioned Spike Lee's School Days as just one other example. But as Jones starts off here, like most high school students, I knew very little of Black colleges outside of what I saw in the sitcom A Different World. So quite serendipitously, he starts off this way, as do a number of other articles that I've been looking at that we'll come back to at some point. But essentially the point is that obviously is a spinoff of The Cosby Show at a time when Cosby and that show were at the height of their popularity in the late 80s, early 90s. You have the spinoff created as a vehicle for Lisa Bonet that takes a life of its own. And A Different World became its own phenomena, particularly among Black and other television audiences, suggesting an experience that most who would have any thought of going to college, certainly, and some who wouldn't, would want to experience. But as Jones says here, and again, we're going to get to it in our conversation in much more detail as the book has so much more to it. When my parents dropped me off on campus in 1995, the desolate appearance of the college made me seriously reconsider enrolling because it did not match the picture of Hillman College, the fictitious college depicted in in A Different World, or University of Alabama Pine Bluffs, is I think the one he's talking about here. And whether, for those of us at Morgan, certainly Howard, probably Spelman and Morehouse, some of the bigger HBCUs, this is less of an issue. Certainly at Morgan State now, where there's so much construction, this is almost hardly the case, except for some of the older buildings some are still residing in or having to deal with. But For a lot of HBCUs, this is more or less the case. And even where the artifice is reconstructed in a certain way to make the campus more beautified, the insides, the inner workings, certainly the resources allotted to faculty, for instance.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
Pale in comparison, pun intended, to some of the distribution we would see at PWIs or that we should see in an institution that is nominally there to function for an already aggrieved community. Also, by the way, again, please forgive the fact that I'm working off of a draft copy that I got of the book. I will be getting my full copy as soon as it's available, and we will be working from that once we start moving towards the interview with Professor Jones and encouraging you to get. But this was sent to me so I could construct the blurb, but and I just couldn't put it down, so to speak, despite it being a virtual digital copy. But again, we're going to get more into it when we have the interview. But for our purposes here, just in this moment, what he shows here is, as he points out, that the condition of most private and some public historically Black colleges in the first couple of decades in the 21st century is in constant peril. And this is something that I have struggled with a lot and continue to struggle with. Yes, obviously Black people are oppressed community. Yes, HBCUs are in constant peril, financially, resource-wise, all kinds of problems. And yet, what bothers me the most is something that he does talk about that I look forward to talking about more when we have the interview. And that is certainly an impetus behind my wanting to do Not a Different World as a project, beyond just wanting to get off my chest the experiences I've endured personally. But that, as he points out to here, today, and he himself, as he talks about, was a president of an HBCU. Today, many HBCUs employ presidents who practice misleadership and express little interest in providing leadership that will lead their institutions towards any liberating goal. So yes, there's already a structural disadvantage to Black life and Black institution building, but the complicity of the leadership, the misleadership, is a perennial problem, but only a problem when we fail to understand beyond the mythology and the narrative construction what these institutions are here to do. They're not here to be liberating spaces. So in that regard, the presidents are not engaged in any form of misleadership. And I'll certainly want to ask Jones about this when we build that. Given their mission, the actual mission of these institutions, there's nothing wrong with what the presidents are doing. As he says here, presidents at these institutions are most often chosen for their autocratic, conservative, respectable, charismatic, and missionary demeanors, which perpetuate the dysfunctional culture and dependency mindset. Again, a point to which we'll return. The development here is the idea of a pan-Black college and university that would have such leadership at its helm that is dedicated completely to transforming the college into a place that embraces justice, welcomes criticism, fosters academic freedom, and is completely devoted to a student and employee success. So again, we're going to come back to this more than this is not what I want to focus on here, because this is part of the challenge that I think faces not only HBCUs, but us more broadly speaking. But I just did want to quickly introduce and summarize what this book is going to be arguing for and seeks to set up as distinct from what is happening now. And that's really the point I want to drive home in this moment, that these are not institutions currently arranged to develop a Pan-Africanism, a radical Blackness, a liberatory set of ideas and frames of analysis and interpretation, et cetera, and so forth. They're not here to do that. But what I do want to draw some attention to before closing in this video and encouraging, again, people to participate in this project, inviting you to, is that this is what the project is meant to focus on and clarify and give some voice to. Our own, some forced complicity. Some go willingly, some are happy to do it. Others of us feel a certain level of manipulation. But as he says here, as I mentioned in my preface, I'm not above the same criticism I levy against Black colleges. I practice the art of misleadership as an administrator by not respecting the very people I led or the institution I served. As a junior scholar, I can admit that I miseducated some of my students by not taking the time to update my test and lecture notes yearly. I added to the dysfunction of several institutions by gossiping and disregarding protocols and policies to serve my interest. At one point, I told prospective students not to attend my alma mater because I did not trust the administration or faculty. I have supported philanthropy-based programs knowing that it would have no bearing on educating our students so that we can get money to pay the bills. I have ridiculed students about how they speak and dress in my classrooms. I am guilty of being in rooms where unjust decisions were rendered to employees and students and allowed them to unfold to protect the institution. That one, I can't say maybe to protect the institution, but I have been guilty of that. I'm not allowed in any rooms like that anymore, so I don't have to worry about this contradiction at this point. But the reality is, over time, over the years, I have felt I can't wage this fight right now. I won't be effective in this fight right now. I don't have the energy emotionally or physically or otherwise to have this fight right now. And I've let certain things go, knowing that they would have either a negative impact or that they were unjust decisions as it related to other employees or students. Now, I was never an administrator, never a president, and never allowed to exercise my rank and seniority as a faculty member. But the reality is I could have always made more of a fuss than I did in these certain instances. Not always. I could have in these certain instances. In many others, I did raise enough of a fuss that, whatever. But I just acknowledge that we are given every opportunity in these institutions to fail wherever our perceived if our perceived mission goes beyond what these institutions are find acceptable. Overall, it is impossible to work at an HBCU and not succumb to the culture at some point or another. The lesson I learned over the years is that all of my actions were the antithesis of Blackness, not acting Black. So yet again, we will have more of a discussion of that book when it comes out and when we schedule the time with the author. But I just wanted to sort of give an update as it relates to this project and what may change the direction of the final version of this project, maybe push it more towards memoir, and also to use this moment to encourage more participation in the Not a Different World project, the link to which is in the show description. One last thing to bring up as it relates to this is work I've talked about here before. We've done interviews and panels with the author. He's a former colleague of mine at Morgan State who unfortunately had to leave Morgan State to not only complete this great book we're going to talk here a little bit about, and maybe get him back on to do a better interview, because the original interview had some technical difficulties, didn't really work too well. But I think speaks to, again, why I'm doing this Not a Different World project and why I'm yet again inviting some more participation, even as I'm taking my time with this, as I'm calling it, longitudinal study. So the book by Dr. Jelani Favors, my former colleague at Morgan State University, is again titled Shelter in a Time of Storm: How Black Colleges Foster Generations of Leadership and Activism. And throughout the book, but also here in the epilogue, he raises a couple points that I just want to quickly point to that speak to why I'm doing this project, again, beyond my own personal experience. One of which is, again, he mentions here, as it comes up often in literature about the HBCUs of a certain generation, is he's asking the epilogue, it's a different world, the rise of the hip hop generation and the corruption of the Black college communitas. As he says here, he sat glued to his television set, immersed in an episode of A Different World. Again, the offshoot of The Cosby Show, which as a young person encouraged his engagement with HBCUs, his eventual working with me. Not that he writes about this in the book, but what eventually led to him being a colleague of mine for a time at Morgan State University. But also, as he points out in this epilogue, a point that I'm speaking to in my own project. I'm calling it not a different world. What he's saying when he says it is a different world, that it's not the world we see in the show A Different World. What we see in A Different World is it is a different world from It's a Different World. In other words, I'm saying the HBCU is not the different space that it claims to be. And he's saying it's not what the TV show used to say it was. And for the sake of brevity, to summarize his summary as to why it is a different world in his language or why it is not a different world in mine, Favors says there are three. That is three reasons why it's not a different world for him as the TV show, and it's not a different world for me as a world that is the TV show. First, he says these critically important institutions had to reckon with the challenges of integration. So he points to the fact that after integration became legal in this country, a lot of Black students found acceptance, were invited to, chose to move to PWIs for, as he says here, greener pastures, which led in some cases to brain drain, a Black brain drain of both students, athletes, and faculty as well. Secondly, the curriculum itself faced, that is the curriculum at HBCUs, and he goes through the history and of that curriculum and of those early, the official curriculum, the social curriculum. He does all of this. It's a great book. He says, secondly, the curriculum itself faced serious challenges. The promise of corporate and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics jobs, which offered a higher earning potential after graduation, caused many to steer clear of the humanities. Potential activists were less and less likely to take the traditional courses that had the potential to politicize them.
Message.
And then lastly, years of historic underfunding exacerbated these institutions' internal struggles, marring relationships between trustee, board members, administrators, faculty, students, and thus created a public relations nightmare that effectively weakened the brand of HBCUs and prevented a new generation of potential students and faculty from considering matriculation. My bias, my experience, my focus is on this second point more than any. After the 1960s and 70s, as he details in this book, the shift of funding to HBCUs in particular targeted STEM, distracted and discouraged humanities, and anything that would lead to a radical critical consciousness. The Black college communitas was not completely broken, but the privileging of STEM fields would further undermine the intellectual foundations of Black militancy. The idealism, race consciousness, and cultural nationalism that defined the second curriculum, again, the genealogy he traces early in the book, had fed the freedom dreams of Black college students for generations. It was powered by faculty who operated out of departments and programs that stimulated critical thought. Students, in turn, linked those ideas with messages that they received from visiting speakers, returning alumni, and sometimes administrators themselves. Following the climax of the civil rights movement, however, those departments were increasingly marginalized. Almost every major financial investment coming into HBCUs was being funneled toward the hard sciences. Social science programs and humanities departments languished. After a brief bump in the beginning of the 1970s, enrollment in the humanities suffered a precipitous dip toward the end of the decade and flatlined for almost the next 40 years with negligible gains. And today we're seeing many of the aftermath effects of that, and it is wreaking havoc on the faculty experience for sure, and and definitely the radical potential for students themselves to be realized. But I'll wrap here today with the way Favors ends his book by referencing Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, who, speaking at North Carolina A&T March 21st, 1971, in honor of the 11th anniversary of the Sharpeville Massacre in South Africa, Carmichael powerfully declared, "You are Black students. Your people are in trouble. You have an obligation to your people. Your obligation is as students to use your analytical minds for the development of your people, not for yourselves." That's a nigger concept. It is you who must analyze the problems. You are the students. You have the analytical minds. The farmers and the peasants and the sharecroppers cannot do that. The breadwinners of the families cannot do that. But you have the opportunity and you have the tools at your disposal in the terms of the books in the library. It is your duty to study. It is your duty to use your minds for the benefit of your people, to analyze the problems that we pose and to give us the correct solution. That is your duty. What other purpose do you serve? And that, dear friends, colleagues, comrades, and enemies, is the crux of the problem. One that my experiences come crashing up against, one I see students' experiences coming crashing up against, and one that unfortunately Kwame Ture is no longer here to help us interpret and correct. That is the shift that Favors traces in his book, the shift that Jones traces in his book, and the one that I will hope to describe in whatever forthcoming version of this project evolves, is the shift that targeted what Carmichael or Kwame Ture was speaking to at that moment, that targeted the Black student at particularly HBCUs for a negation of any potentially radical or radicalizing experience. And after that fact is established, the cascading, precipitating, trickle down abuses encourage projects such as Not a Different World. So thanks for checking this out. If you qualify, if you're interested, please consider reviewing the Not a Different World project, HBCU project in the show description and submitting a response. And along with everyone else, please like, share, subscribe, become a member of this channel. And thanks for tuning in. As always, peace, only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And I'll catch you next time here at
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.